Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. It is so good to have you here for episode 5 of Flex Your Vote, where we will be breaking down Proposition 30. And for those of you who are new to the channel, welcome. It's great to have you here. I would encourage you to catch up on episodes 1 through 4 and then join us back here in this video, so you can gain an introduction on the video series, an overview of how measures make it onto the California ballot, and then of course catch up on propositions that you have missed prior to this episode. And for those of you continuing on the journey with me, thank you for being here. And we have a very interesting proposition today. The effect of Proposition 30 is actually quite straightforward. There are really only 2 delineated effects of the proposition, but it requires a broader understanding of our current climate crisis in California, our current zero emissions vehicle programs, and our current goals and resource limitations for lowering our greenhouse gas emissions as a state. So, some interesting context to explore as we dive into this proposition. So, I hope you're ready for this dive, and let's start episode 5. Okay, so let's begin by discussing the climate situation in California, along with several new goals set by the legislature to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, it's no secret that California suffers from very high temperatures, dry climate, and extreme summer temperatures. And this has been quite evident with all of the wildfires that California has been battling over the many years. And they have simply expanded and escalated in severity in recent years. And this is something, while concerning, we as a state can do something about and hopefully reverse this trend over time. The effects may not appear immediate if we were to improve our greenhouse gas emissions, but an intervention immediately is what is necessary to reverse this trend over time. Now, there was a study conducted by the Scripps Institute of Oceanography that looked at the climate situation in California. And researchers found that from the period of 1972 to 2018, there was a 5-fold increase in the number of wildfires that ravaged our state. And this is essentially due to increasing temperatures, and very much to blame is our emissions in the state of California. About 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions derive from our transportation. California is the most populated state in the United States, and of course, that means the number of vehicles is at an all-time high here in California. And so the transportation emissions account for 50% of our statewide emissions, and therefore is a wonderful opportunity for us to reduce our emissions as a state. So with that background, there are several goals that the legislature has introduced to try and lower our emissions and to also combat and prevent over time the escalating wildfire situation in California. Now, the first goal begins at 2030, where the legislature will require by 2030 that all rideshare companies such as Lyft and Uber are able to log 90% of their miles, 90% of their rides in electric vehicles. So only about 10% of rideshare miles can be completed in non-electric vehicles. Now, by 2035, there will be a ban for the sale of new gas-powered vehicles. This will not ban constituents or visitors to California from driving a gas-powered vehicle. However, dealers will be entirely banned from selling new gas-powered vehicles. There are exceptions for hybrid vehicles, but the essence of the goal is to ban new sales of all gas vehicles. Now, by 2040, California has set an ambitious but a necessary goal of achieving carbon neutrality. And carbon neutrality essentially means that there will be a balance in the carbon that is introduced to the atmosphere and carbon removed from it as well. And then by 2050, the goal is to reach at least 80% reduction in our greenhouse gas emission, and the standard is our emissions in the year of 1990. So at least an 80% reduction to our 1990 standard. So those are the overarching goals that we as a state are hoping to accomplish up until the point of the year 2050. And essentially, climatologists have advised that if goals to reduce greenhouse emissions are not aggressive and are not immediate, then we essentially lose the window of intervention and of preventing this climate crisis escalation that we are experiencing worldwide. So that is the context for Proposition 30. Now, what would Proposition 30 accomplish? Well, it would be accomplishing two specific things. First and foremost, Proposition 30 would increase tax on personal income over $2 million by about 1.75%. And this would be applicable to both individuals and to married couples, and in effect from January 2023 up until January 2043. So a maximum period of 20 years. However, it could be terminated early. This additional tax could be terminated early if California as a state is able to reach its clean air goals. Specifically, that by 2050, we must reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by at least 80% below our 1990 markers. Now, the second effect of Proposition 30 would be to distribute this tax revenue in two ways. 80% would fund and expand our zero emissions vehicle programs, and 20% would be used to invest in, fund, and expand our wildfire response and prevention programs. Let's begin with this initial 80%. This 80% would also be split in two ways. Portion of this 80% funding would be used to specifically help individuals, businesses, and government organizations finance and invest in zero emissions vehicles to ensure that accessibility to clean air vehicles is financially equitable, is something that any individual or any business who wishes to invest in clean air vehicles is able to have some sort of financial support in order to purchase these vehicles and utilize them to improve our air in the state of California. A remaining portion would be used to build and to operate new clean air vehicle charging stations throughout the state. These would be constructed in apartment complexes, single-family residences, and also just public areas where they can be easily accessed by drivers who are operating clean air vehicles. And the hope is to make sure that these charging stations are very accessible and they're just more common throughout the state of California. There is one specification that about 50% of this funding in zero emissions vehicle programs be dedicated to communities with a high air pollution amount or a low income threshold. The remaining 50% can be used anywhere in the state, so long that it is focused on zero emissions vehicle programs such as financing clean air vehicles, building new charging stations, or programs that align with that type of focus. Now, this 20% of the tax revenue would then go to investing in wildfire response and prevention programs. California annually spends upwards of $2 billion just to fight wildfires that have already occurred. And so the hope is by investing in prevention and response programming, we may be able to mitigate the costs in the aftermath of these wildfires ensuing. So a majority of this wildfire response funding must be focused on hiring, training, and retaining firefighters, as firefighters throughout the state of California are the ones responsible for fighting and preventing our wildfires. The remaining of the funds can be utilized in any type of programming to invest in wildfire prevention. So those are the two avenues in which the tax revenue must be distributed. Okay, so let's talk arguments for and against, and let's talk money. To date, there has been a total of $71.9 million invested into this race. Supporters have contributed $48.1 million, while opponents to Proposition 30 have invested $23.8 million. Important to note that rideshare companies fall in support of Proposition 30 and have invested significantly to that $48.1 million amount. And supporters largely emphasize that expanding and funding our zero emissions vehicle programs will directly lead to more clean air vehicles on the road and a significant drop in our greenhouse gas emissions. Because as we discussed, 50% of our greenhouse gas emissions in the state of California derive from our transportation. So replacing gas-powered vehicles in large numbers with clean air vehicles will reduce our emissions, and this can only be accomplished by providing this financial support and this financial incentive for individuals, businesses, and government organizations to actually invest in these clean air vehicles. Also, supporters point to the fact that investing in wildfire prevention and wildfire response is critical. Currently, California expends about $2 billion or more per year just to combat wildfires that have already occurred. So redirecting our funding to really introducing and investing in capable and well-trained firefighters and new creative preventive strategies is a cost-effective and just overall more strategic way to approach the wildfire crisis in California. Now, the opposition is very interesting. Opponents believe that there is already sufficient funding to incentivize and to help support individuals in purchasing clean air vehicles, but the largest part of the criticism in this proposition amounts to the support coming from rideshare companies. So as we discussed in the introduction to this video, one of the goals is for rideshare companies by 2030 to log at least 90% of their miles in electric vehicles. With this goal in mind, which has already been passed by our legislature, opponents to Proposition 30 are emphasizing the fact that passing Proposition 30 would just remove the financial burden from these rideshare companies to actually comply with this new goal in place. Because regardless of where the financing is coming from, rideshare companies must meet this goal of logging 90% of their miles in electric vehicles. But what that means is rideshare companies will have to invest in more electric vehicles, and either they can pay for it or individuals with personal incomes over $2 million can pay for it. And the latter would be the situation if Proposition 30 were to be passed. So it's effectively passing the buck of the charge to other individuals rather than having rideshare companies actually take ownership of how to reach this goal in a self-sufficient process. And opponents also suggest that this is distracting from the kind of steps and the goals that each of us as individuals, businesses, and government organizations can take to reduce our own emissions and contribute to successfully reaching the goals that our legislature has introduced. That if we're simply just raising the funds and making more money available, that's not necessarily a behavioral change that will lead to decreased emissions. That's just throwing more money at the situation rather than addressing the root cause of the problem, which is individual choices, organizational and business choices to be clean energy minded. So that is our overview of Proposition 30. I hope the context was useful and helps place the proposition in its essential perspective. And looking forward to 2 more videos with you all, finishing up our propositions on the 2022 California ballot. And I will see you in the next video.